About the beginning of the year 1851, the rage for emigration to California from the United States was at its height. All sorts and conditions of men, old, young, and middle-aged, allured by the hope of acquiring sudden wealth, and fascinated with the adventure and excitement of a life in California, were relinquishing their existing pursuits and associations to commence a totally new existence in the land of gold. The rush of eager gold hunters was so great that the Panama Steamship Company's office in New York used to be perfectly mobbed for a day and a night. Sailing vessels were dispatched for Chagres almost daily, carrying crowds of passengers while numbers went by the different routes through Mexico, and others chose the easier but more tedious passage round Cape Horn. The emigration from the western states was naturally very large, the inhabitants being a class of men whose lives are spent in clearing the wild forests of the west and gradually driving the Indian from his hunting ground. Of these western frontier men, it is often said that they are never satisfied if there is any white man between them and sundown. They are constantly moving westward, for as the wild Indian is forced to retire before them, so they, in their turn, shrinking from the signs of civilization which their own labors cause to appear around them, have to plunge deeper into the forest in search of that wild border life which has such charms for all who have ever experienced it. To men of this sort, the accounts of such a country as California, thousands of miles to the westward of them, were peculiarly attractive, and so great was the emigration that many parts of the western states were nearly depopulated. The route followed by these people was overland across the plains, which was the most congenial to their tastes and the most convenient for them, as, besides being already so far to the westward, they were also provided with the necessary wagons and oxen for the journey. For the sake of mutual protection against the Indians, they traveled in trains of a dozen or more wagons, carrying the women and children and provisions, accompanied by a proportionate number of men, some on horses or mules, and others on foot. In May 1851, I happened to be residing in New York and was seized with the California fever. My preparations were very soon made, and a day or two afterwards I found myself on board a small bark about to sail for Chagres with a load of California emigrants. Our vessel was little more than 200 tons and was entirely devoted to the accommodation of passengers. The ballast was covered with a temporary deck, and the whole interior of the ship formed a saloon, round which were built 3 tiers of berths. A very rough extemporary table and benches completed the furniture. There was no invidious distinction of cabin and steerage passengers, in fact. Excepting the captain's room, there was nothing which could be called a cabin in the ship. But all were in good spirits, and so much engrossed with thoughts of California that there was little disposition to grumble at the rough and ready style of our accommodation. For my own part, I knew I should have to rough it in California, and felt that I might just as well begin at once as wait till I got there. We numbered about 60 passengers, and a nice assortment we were. The majority, of course, were Americans, and were from all parts of the Union. The rest were English, French, and German. We had representatives of nearly every trade, besides farmers, engineers, lawyers, doctors, merchants, and nondescript young men. The first day out, we had fine weather, with just sea enough to afford the uninitiated an opportunity of discovering the difference between the lee and the weather side of the ship. The second day, we had a fresh breeze, which towards night blew a gale, and for a couple of days we were compelled to lay to. The greater part of the passengers, being from the interior of the country, had never seen the ocean before, and a gale of wind was a thing they did not understand at all. Those who were not too sick to be able to form an opinion on the subject were frightened out of their senses, and imagined that all manner of dreadful things were going to happen to the ship. The first night of the gale, I was awakened by an old fool shouting frantically to the company in general to get up and save the ship, because he heard the water rushing into her, and we should sink in a few minutes. He was very emphatically cursed for his trouble by those whose slumbers he had disturbed, and told to hold his tongue and let those sleep who could, if he were unable to do so himself. It was certainly, however, not very easy to sleep that night. The ship was very crank, and but few of the party had taken the precaution to make fast their luggage. The consequence was that boxes and chests of all sizes, besides casks of provisions and other ship's stores, which had got adrift, were cruising about promiscuously, threatening to smash up the flimsy framework on which our berths were built and endangering the limbs of anyone who should venture to turn out. In the morning, we found that the cook's galley had fetched way, and the stove was rendered useless. The steward and waiters' landlubbers, who were only working their passage to Chagres, were as sick as the sickest, and so the prospect for breakfast was by no means encouraging. However, there were not more than half a dozen of us who could eat anything, or could even stand on deck. So we roughed it out on cold beef, hard bread, and brandy and water. The sea was not very high, and the ship lay too comfortably and dry, but in the evening some of the poor wretches below had worked themselves up to desperation, being sure every time the ship laid over that she was never coming up again. At last, one man, who could stand it no longer, jumped out of his berth and, going down on his knees, commenced clapping his hands and uttering the most dismal howls and groans, interspersed with disjointed fragments of prayers. He called on all hands to join him, but it was not a form of worship to which many seemed to be accustomed, for only 2 men responded to his call. He very kindly consigned all the rest of the company to a place which I trust none of us may reach, and prayed that for the sake of the 3 righteous men himself and the other 2 the ship might be saved. They continued for about an hour, clapping their hands as if applauding, and crying and groaning most piteously, so bereft of sense by fear that they seemed not to know the meaning of their incoherent exclamations. The captain, however, at last succeeded in persuading them that there was no danger, and they gradually cooled down, to the great relief of the rest of the passengers. The next day we had better weather, but the sick list was as large as ever, and we had to mess again on whatever raw materials we could lay our hands on: red herrings, onions, ham, and biscuit. We deposed the steward as a useless vagabond, and appointed 3 passengers to fill his place, after which we fared a little better, in fact, as well as the provisions at our command would allow. No one grumbled, except in a few of the lowest class of men in the party, who had very likely never been used to such good living ashore. When we got into the trade winds, we had delightful weather, very hot, but with a strong breeze at night, rendering it sufficiently cool to sleep in comfort. The all-engrossing subject of conversation and of meditation was, of course, California, and the heaps of gold we were all to find there. As we had secured our passage only as far as Chagres, our progress from that point to San Francisco was also a matter of constant discussion. We all knew that every steamer to leave Panama for months to come was already full, and that hundreds of men were waiting there to take advantage of any opportunity that might occur of reaching San Francisco. But among our passengers, there were very few who were traveling in company. They were mostly all isolated individuals, each on his own hook, and everyone was perfectly confident that he at least would have no trouble in getting along, whatever might be the fate of the rest of the crowd. We added to the delicacies of our bill of fare occasionally by killing dolphins. They are very good eating and afford capital sport. They come in small shoals of a dozen or so and amuse themselves by playing about before the bows of the vessel, when, getting down into the martingale under the bowsprit, one takes the opportunity to let drive at them with the grains. On arriving at Chagres, they became quite dejected and sulky, and seemed to be oppressed with anxiety, while the others were in a wild state of delight at having finished a tedious passage, and in anticipation of the novelty and excitement of crossing the isthmus. In the morning, several shore boats, all pulled by Americans, came off to take us ashore. The landing here is rather dangerous. There is generally a very heavy swell, causing vessels to roll so much that getting into a small boat alongside is a matter of considerable difficulty, and at the mouth of the river is a bar, on which are immense rollers, requiring good management to get over them in safety. We went ashore in torrents of rain, and when landed with our baggage on the muddy bank of the Chagres River, all as wet as if we had swum ashore, we were immediately beset by crowds of boatmen, Americans, natives, and Jamaica, all endeavoring to make a bargain with us for the passage up the river to Cruces. The town of Chagres is built on each side of the river and consists of a few miserable cane and mud huts with one or two equally wretched-looking wooden houses, which were hotels kept by Americans. On the top of the bluff, on the south side of the river, are the ruins of an old Spanish castle, which look very picturesque, almost concealed by the luxurious growth of trees and creepers around them. The natives seemed to be a miserable set of people, and the few Americans in the town were most sickly, washed-out-looking objects with the appearance of having been steeped for a length of time in water. After breakfasting on ham and beans at one of the hotels, we selected a boat to convey us up the river, and as the owner had no crew engaged, we got him to take 2 sailors who had run away from our vessel and were bound for California like the rest of us. There was a great variety of boats employed on the river: whale boats, ship's boats, skiffs, and canoes of all sizes, some of them capable of carrying 15 or 20 people. It was still raining heavily when we started, but shortly afterwards the weather cleared up, and we felt in better humor to enjoy the magnificent scenery. The river was from 75 to 100 yards wide, and the banks were completely hidden by the dense mass of vegetation overhanging the water. There was a vast variety of beautiful foliage, and many of the trees were draped in creepers, covered with large flowers of most brilliant colors. One of our party, who was a Scotch gardener, was in ecstasies at such a splendid natural flower show, and gave us long Latin names for all the different specimens. The rest of my fellow passengers were a big fat man from Buffalo, 2 young Southerners from South Carolina, 3 New Yorkers, and a Swede. The boat was rather heavily laden, but for some hours we got along very well, as there was but little current. Towards the afternoon, however, our 2 sailors, who had been pulling all the time, began to flag, and at last said they could go no further without a rest. We were still many miles from the place where we were to pass the night, and as the banks of the river presented such a formidable barricade of jungle as to prevent a landing, we had the prospect of passing the night in the boat, unless we made the most of our time. So the gardener and I volunteered to take a spell at the oars. But as we ascended the river, the current became much stronger, and darkness overtook us some distance from our intended stopping place. It became so very dark that we could not see 6 feet ahead of us, and were constantly bumping against other boats coming up the river. There were also many boats coming down with the current at such a rate that if one had happened to run into us, we should have had but a poor chance, and we were obliged to keep shouting all the time to let our whereabouts be known. We were several times nearly capsized on snags, and as we really could not see whether we were making any way or not, we came to the determination of making fast to a tree till the moon should rise. It was now raining again as heavily as ever, and having fully expected to make the station that evening, we had taken no provisions with us. We were all very wet, very hungry, and more or less inclined to be in a bad humor. Consequently, the question of stopping or going ahead was not determined without a great deal of wrangling and discussion. However, our 2 sailors declared they would not pull another stroke. The gardener and myself were in favor of stopping, and as none of the rest of our number were at all inclined to exert themselves, the question was thus settled for them, although they continued to discuss it for their own satisfaction for some time afterwards. It was about 8 o'clock when, catching hold of a bough of a tree, 12 or 15 feet from the shore, we made fast. We could not attempt to land, as the shore was so guarded by bushes and sunken branches as to render the nearer approach of the boat impossible. So here we were, 13 of us, with a proportionate pile of baggage cramped up in a small boat in which we had spent the day and were now doomed to pass the night, our miseries aggravated by torrents of rain, nothing to eat, and, worse than that, nothing to drink. But, worse than all, without even a dry match wherewith to light a pipe. If ever it is excusable to chew tobacco, it surely is on such an occasion as this. I had worked a good deal at the oar, and from the frequent alterations we had experienced of scorching heat and drenching rain, I felt as if I could enjoy a nap, notwithstanding the disagreeableness of our position. But, fearing the consequences of sleeping under such circumstances in that climate, I kept myself awake the best way I could. We managed to get through the night somehow, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, as the moon began to give sufficient light to let us see where we were, we got under way again, and after a couple of hours' hard pulling, we arrived at the place we had expected to reach the evening before. It was a very beautiful little spot, a small, natural clearing on the top of a high bank, on which were 1 or 2 native huts, and a canvas establishment which had been set up by a Yankee and was called a hotel. We went to this hotel and found some 20 or 30 fellow travelers who had there enjoyed a night's rest, and were now just sitting down to breakfast at a long, rough table which occupied the greater part of the house. The kitchen consisted of a cooking stove in one corner, and opposite to it was the bar, which was supplied with a few bottles of bad brandy, while a number of canvas shelves, ranged all round, constituted the dormitory. We made up for the loss of our supper by eating a hearty breakfast of ham, beans, and eggs, and started again in company with our more fortunate fellow travelers. The weather was once more bright and clear, and confined as we were between the densely wooded and steaming banks of the river, we found the heat most oppressive. We saw numbers of parrots of brilliant plumage and a great many monkeys and alligators, at which there was a constant discharge of pistols and rifles, our passage being further enlivened by an occasional race with some of the other boats. The river still continued to become more rapid, and our progress was consequently very slow. The 2 sailors were quite unable to work all day at the oars. The owner of the boat was a useless encumbrance. He could not even steer, so the gardener and myself were again obliged occasionally to exert ourselves. The fact is, the boat was overloaded. 2 men were not a sufficient crew, and if we had not worked ourselves, we should never have got to Cruces. I wanted the other passengers to do their share of work for the common good, but some protested they did not know how to pull, others pleaded bad health, and the rest very coolly said that, having paid their money to be taken to Cruces, they expected to be taken there, and would not pull a stroke. They did not care how long they might be on the river. It was evident that we had made a bad bargain, and if these other fellows would not lend a hand, it was only the more necessary that someone else should. It was rather provoking to see them sitting doggedly under their umbrellas, but we could not well pitch them overboard or put them ashore, and I comforted myself with the idea that their turn would certainly come, notwithstanding their obstinacy. After a tedious day, during which we had, as before, deluges of rain, with intervals of scorching sunshine, we arrived about 6 o'clock at a native settlement, where we were to spend the night. It was a small clearing, with merely 2 or 3 huts, inhabited by 8 or 10 miserable-looking natives, mostly women. Their lazy, listless way of doing things did not suit the humor we were in at all. The invariable reply to all demands for something to eat and drink was poco tiempo, by, said in that sort of tone one would use to a troublesome child. They knew very well we were at their mercy. We could not go anywhere else for our supper, and they took it easy accordingly. We succeeded at last in getting supper in installments, now a mouthful of ham, now an egg or a few beans, and then a cup of coffee, just as they would make up their minds to the violent exertion of getting these articles ready for us. About half a dozen other boatloads of passengers were also stopping here, some 50 or 60 of us altogether, and 3 small shanties were the only shelter to be had. The native population crowded into one of them and, in consideration of sundry dollars, allowed us the exclusive enjoyment of the other two. They were mere sheds about 15 feet square, open all round. But as the rain was again pouring down, we thought of the night before, and were thankful for small mercies. I secured a location with 3 or 4 others in the upper story of one of these places, a sort of loft made of bamboos about 8 feet from the ground, to which we climbed by means of a pole with notches cut in it. The next day, we found the river more rapid than ever. Oars were now useless. We had to pole the boat up the stream, and at last the patience of the rest of the party was exhausted, and they reluctantly took their turn at the work. We hardly made 12 miles and halted in the evening at a place called Dos Hermanos, where were 2 native houses. Here we found already about 50 fellow travelers, and several parties arrived after us. On the native landlord we were all dependent for supper, but we at least were a little too late, as there was nothing to be had but boiled rice and coffee, not even beans. There were a few live chickens about, which we would soon have disposed of, but cooking was out of the question. It was raining furiously, and there were 60 or 70 of us, all huddled into 2 small places of 15 feet square, together with a number of natives and Jamaican, the crews of some of the boats. Several of the passengers were in different stages of drunkenness, generally developing itself in a desire to fight, and more particularly to pitch into the natives. There seemed a prospect of a general set-to between black and white, which would have been a bloody one, as all the passengers had either a revolver or a bowie knife. Most of them had both, and the natives were provided with their machetes. Half knife, half cutlass, which they always carry and know how to use. Many of the Americans, however, were of the better class, and used their influence to quiet the more unruly of their countrymen. One man made a most touching appeal to their honor not to kick up a muss, as there was a lady of their own color in the next room, who was in a state of great agitation. The 2 rooms opened into each other, and were so full of men that one could hardly turn round, and the lady of our own color was, of course, a myth. However, the more violent of the crowd quieted down a little, and affairs looked more pacific. We passed a most miserable night. We lay down as best we could, and were packed like sardines in a box. All wanted to sleep, but if one man moved, he woke half a dozen others, who again, in waking, roused all the rest. So sleep was, like our supper, only to be enjoyed in imagination, and all we could do was to wait intently for daylight. As soon as we could see, we all left the wretched place, none of us much improved in temper or in general condition. It was still raining, and we had the pleasure of knowing that we should not get any breakfast for 2 or 3 hours. We had another severe day on the river, hot sun, heavy rains, and hard work, and in the afternoon we arrived at Gorgona, a small village where a great many passengers leave the river and take the road to Panama. Cruces is about 7 miles farther up the river, and from there the road to Panama is said to be much better, especially in wet weather, when the Gorgona road is almost impassable. The village of Gorgona consisted of a number of native shanties, built in the usual style of thin canes, between any 2 of which you might put your finger, and fastened together in basket fashion with the long woody tendrils with which the woods abound. The roof is of palm leaves, slanting up to a great height, so as to shed the heavy rains. Some of these houses have only 3 sides, others have only 2, while some have none at all, being open all round. And in all of them might be seen 1 or more natives swinging in a hammock, calmly and patiently, waiting for time to roll on, or, it may be, deriving intense enjoyment from the mere consciousness of existence. After our fatigues on the river, and the miserable way in which we had passed the night before, such sleep-in accommodation as this appeared very inviting, and immediately after dinner I appropriated one of the beds and slept even on till daylight. We met here several men who were returning from Panama, on their way home again. They had been waiting there for some months for a steamer, by which they had tickets for San Francisco and which was coming round the Horn. She was long overdue, however, and, having lost patience, they were going home, in the vain hope of getting damages out of the owner of the steamer. If they had been very anxious to go to California, they might have sold their tickets and taken the opportunity of a sailing vessel from Panama. But from the way in which they spoke of their grievances, it was evident that they were homesick and glad of any excuse to turn tail and go back again. We had frequently, on our way up the river, seen different parties of our fellow passengers. At Gorgona we mustered strong, and we found that, notwithstanding the disadvantage we had been under of having an overloaded boat, we had made as good time as any of them. A great many here took the road for Panama, but we determined to go on by the river to Cruces, for the sake of the better road from that place. All our difficulties hitherto were nothing to what we encountered in these last few miles. It was one continual rapid all the way, and in many places some of us were obliged to get out and tow the boat, while the rest used the poles. We were all heartily disgusted with the river, and were satisfied when we arrived at Cruces that we had got over the worst of the isthmus. For, however bad the road might be, it could not be harder traveling than we had already experienced. In establishing their hotels at different points on the Chagres River, the Americans encountered great opposition from the natives, who wished to reap all the benefit of the travel themselves. But they were too many centuries behind the age to have any chance in fair competition, and so they resorted to personal threats and violence till the persuasive eloquence of Colt's revolvers and the overwhelming numbers of American travelers convinced them that they were wrong, and that they had better submit to their fate. One branch of business which the natives had all to themselves was mule driving, and carrying baggage over the road from Cruces to Panama, and at this they had no competition to fear from anyone. The luggage was either packed on mules or carried on men's backs, being lashed into a sort of wicker-work contrivance, somewhat similar to those used by French porters, and so adjusted with straps that the weight bore directly down on the shoulders. It was astonishing to see what loads these men could carry over such a road, and it really seemed inconsistent with their indolent character that they should perform, so actively, such prodigious feats of labor. 250 pounds weight was an average load for a man to walk off with, doing the 25 miles to Panama in a day and a half, and some men carried as much as 300 pounds. They were well made and muscular, though not large men, and were apparently more masculine than the Indian. The journey to Panama was generally performed on mules, but frequently on foot, and as the rest of our party intended to walk, I determined also to forego the luxury of a mule. So, having engaged men to carry our baggage, we set out about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Cruces was just such a village as Gorgona, with a similar canvas hotel, kept by equally cadaverous-looking Americans. The weather was fine, and for a short distance out of Cruces the road was easy enough, and we were beginning to think we should have a pleasant journey. But we were very soon undeceived, for it commenced to rain in the usual style, and the road became most dreadful. It was a continual climb over the rocky beds of precipitous gullies, the gully itself perhaps 10 or 12 feet deep, and the dense wood on each side meeting overhead, so that no fresh air relieved one in toiling along. We could generally see rocks sticking up out of the water on which to put our feet, but we were occasionally, for a considerable distance, up to the knees in water and mud. The steep banks on each side of us were so close together that in many places 2 packed mules could not pass each other. Sometimes, indeed, even a single mule got jammed by the trunk projecting on either side of him. It was a most fatiguing walk. When it did not rain, the heat was suffocating, and when it rained, it poured. There was a place called the Halfway House, to which we looked forward anxiously as the end of our day's journey, and as it was kept by an American, we expected to find it a comparatively comfortable place. But our disappointment was great when, about dark, we arrived at this halfway house and found it to be a miserable little tent, not much more than 12 feet square. On entering, we found some 8 or 10 travelers in the same plight as ourselves, tired, hungry, wet through, and with aching limbs. The only furniture in the tent consisted of a rough table 3 feet long and 3 cots. The ground was all wet and sloppy, and the rain kept dropping through the canvas overhead. There were only 2 plates and 2 knives and forks in the establishment, so we had to pitch into the salt pork and beans 2 at a time, while the rest of the crowd stood round and looked at us, for the cots were the only seats in the place, and they were so rickety that not more than 2 men could sit on them at a time. More travelers continued to arrive, and as the prospect of a night in such a place was so exceedingly dismal, I persuaded our party to return about half a mile to a native hut, which we had passed on the road, to take our chance of what accommodation we could get there. We soon arranged with the woman, who seemed to be the only inhabitant of the house, to allow us to sleep in it, and, as we were all thoroughly soaked, every sort of waterproof coat having proved equally useless after the few days' severe trial we had given them, we looked out anxiously for any of the natives coming along with our trunks. In the meantime, I borrowed a towel from the old woman of the shanty, and, as it was now fair, I went into the bush and got one of our 2 sailors, who had stuck by us, to rub me down as hard as he could. This entirely removed all pain and stiffness, and though I had to put on my wet clothes again, I felt completely refreshed. Not long afterwards, a native made his appearance, carrying the trunk of one of the party, who very generously supplied us all from it with dry clothes when we betook ourselves to our couches. They were not luxurious, being a number of dried hides laid on the floor, as hard as so many sheets of iron, and full of bumps and hollows, but they were dry, which was all we cared about, for we thought of the poor devil sleeping in the mud in the halfway house. The next morning, as we proceeded on our journey, the road gradually improved as the country became more open. We were much refreshed by a light breeze off the sea, which we found a very agreeable change from the damp and suffocating heat of the forest, and about midday, after a pleasant forenoon's walk, we strolled into the city of Panama,